Hey, I'm Andrew Bacon, and for years I used my miter saw on my mobile miter saw stand, and it was fine, but man, when you have to cut long pieces of wood or repetitive cuts with a stop block, it was never really right. It was always wobbling and material was falling off, and so finally I said enough is enough, and I built my dream miter saw station, and I would love to show you how I built it on today's episode of Field Treasure Designs. So I have to say, I was pretty nervous about this project because I had never done cabinets before, but I had to suck it up and grab the van and go get my 6 sheets of 3/4 inch maple plywood and get this project going. It was the dead of winter, and so it was really cold, as you are gonna see with my boots and jackets and sweatshirts and all that good stuff. But yeah, here I am unloading it all and getting ready to cut these down. Thankfully, I had already made my Ron Paulk workbench, and this is perfect for laying it out and cutting down big sheets of plywood. So I grabbed my 1/2 inch sacrificial boards that I use as runners, and I grabbed my first sheet of plywood. As a starting point, I decided to go with 4 2-foot wide base cabinet boxes, and here I'm laying out all of the cut lines so that I can maximize every piece of wood on each sheet of plywood. Now, before I make any cuts, I have to say I wish I had had a track saw. If you are considering this project and debating getting a track saw, this probably is the time to do it. I now own a track saw, and I can honestly say that this project would have been so much easier had I had one. However, it's all good. A circular saw and the Craig rip cut system work just fine, and it's a lot more affordable, so I guess I am glad to show you exactly how to work it this way. But essentially, you just have to work a little harder with the rip cut, especially because it's a circular saw. It's not straight on its own, and it needs to have a guide along the way. Honestly, owning a track saw now, I'm cringing at this setup and can't believe I did this. So basically from here on out, I'm making all of my cuts for my 4 cabinet boxes. So I'm doing the sides, the backs, the bottoms, pretty much everything to create those base cabinet boxes. I'll just let it run here to give you an idea of the different cuts I had to make on these big 4x8 sheets of plywood. And this gives you an opportunity to kind of gauge if you're deciding between a circular saw and the Craig rip cut or a track saw. By the way, I have another video where I detail the differences between the two setups because at one point I was really torn between which one to do, and I didn't have a lot of experience with the track saw. There's a few times I had to take the rip cut apart and just use a straight edge, which I gotta say is not my favorite, but it got the job done. For some other cuts I'll show you in a minute, I did go to my miter saw. So I had ripped down some boards that I needed to now cut to length at the miter station. And as you can see here, this is precisely why I am building this dream miter saw station. And it's also a good reason why a track saw is good, because the rip cut would not go wide enough to make these cuts. So I had to make do on my miter saw to cut about 14 inches, flip it, and then cut the remaining few inches. Okay, for the last cuts for the boxes are the top parts. They don't have to be the full square, and so I'm able to cut them a lot shorter in width. It'll make sense when I go to assemble the boxes. Sweet, the bulk of the big cuts are done. Now I need to mark the corners where I'm going to cut out the notches for the toe kick that will be on the front of each of the base cabinets. Once I had them marked out, I grabbed my jigsaw and went ahead and cut them out. I'm using a larger speed square to keep that edge nice and straight. Okay, 1 down and 7 more to go. After I finished cutting out all the notches, I brought all of the pieces inside to cut the pocket holes, because outside our house it was doing this. Yeah, here's our backyard, so cold. And my garage is insulated, but man, it was like 20 degrees. And for the pocket holes, I thought, okay, we gotta do it inside. So I moved into the kitchen and used the table. I got my Craig K5 jig ready to go. And yeah, I settled in for a very long stretch of drilling pocket holes. I knocked out all the top plates, and then I did the sides, the backs, and the bottoms. I used a marker on my jig to make sure that all of my holes were spaced evenly. I'm sure you get the idea, so I'll go ahead and skip to the end of the month-long journey drilling 1,000 pocket holes. And yes, we did it. That is it. So I had a lot of sawdust all over the table, but it's all good. I was warm again, so I could go back outside to assemble the boxes. However, as you can see, I had a little bit bigger coat on this time. I'm serious, guys. It was so cold out there. So you can now see the box kind of coming together. I dry fitted the bottom just to make sure everything was good. And then I'm going to start by attaching the back to the sides with pocket hole screws. This was my first time using bench dogs in those bench dog holes in my workbench, and man, it works so well having something to push the material against while you fasten it together. I got one side done and then I rotated it to do the other side. Once the sides were done, I was able to tip it up and check my work. Looks good. Now I can tip it back and attach the bottom. Same thing here, just fasten all the pocket hole screws. Here you can see the dimension of the bottom plate is that it's just inside that back plate. So it can attach to that back for extra stability and giving that back a flush look. Okay, time to check my work. So far it's looking good. Now I can tip it back and add the top plates. Here's where you can see those skinnier boards that I'm using. I decided to save some material and not go the entire top because I'm going to cover it with 2 layers of the torsion box assembly. Got the first one done and now I'm adding the second one. Now you can see that gap where I saved some material. Not a huge deal, but I figured it was worth it. Dude, yes, we've got one base cabinet box done. Looks pretty great. Boom, just need to do 3 more. And there they are, all 4 base cabinet boxes ready to go. I set my miter saw on top so I could have a better vantage point to make the measurements as I turned my attention to the torsion box. Luckily, I had just come back from some polar ice fishing, so I still had my down jacket on to keep me warm in my freezing shop. And here I am using my trusty old Craig rip cut again to cut down the bottom of the torsion box. This is also going to have the miter saw sit on top of it. It's 8 feet long, but since my miter station is 10 feet long, I'm going to cut an additional piece that's 2 feet long to add on the end. You'll see that here in a second. Then I took it over to my base cabinets to test it out to make sure it fit perfect. You can see my miter saw on the end there because this is only 8 feet of the 10 feet length. Couple adjustments and yeah, this looks good. I went back to cut one more board to match that 8-foot section. Then I cut it to its right length of 2 feet. Then I took it over to test fit it. Moved the miter saw. It's a little heavy. And then, yeah, it looks good. Next, I set up shop right there to cut the spacers that are going to separate the bottom from the top of the torsion box. I had some wider boards laying around, so I went ahead and cut those to length, and then I took them to my table saw to rip them down to the right width. So the width of the spacers here is largely determined by how high your miter saw is. And then you have to account for the top of your torsion box as well. After I got all my spacers cut, I needed to add pocket holes to the certain sides of each of them because that's how I'm going to attach them so that the screws are hidden. This will all start to make sense here soon, I promise. Okay, one is done. Now I need to do all the rest. Yay. Once I finished the one side on all of them, I went ahead and did the ends on one side to be able to attach them to the back side. After I drilled all the pocket holes, I needed to then make sure that my dimensions were correct for the torsion box. I then went back to my temporary miter station to cut a board that would be used as the spacer between the 3 base cabinets and the single base cabinets, which would make it a true 10 feet in length. After I drilled pocket holes, I clamped it into position to be able to attach it. It's important to measure here to make sure that those cabinets are lined up perfectly so that it's square. I then just screwed them in with pocket hole screws. Once it was set, I took that base that I had made and I put it back on top just to check my dimensions and make sure everything was good. Now this is going to be the bottom where the miter saw sits on top, just like this. Now the next step is to measure in order to make sure that the top of my torsion box is the right dimensions. So the key here was making sure that my miter saw was in its correct position so that I could make the left side and the right side. Once I got my miter saw in its perfect spot, I was then able to measure accordingly on the left and the right. This is about 7 feet of cutoff on the left side, and then I'm going to be able to have about 3 feet on the right side. Also, something to point out is I'm holding the cabinets temporarily by clamps just in case I needed to do any minor adjustments. Okay, so remember when I cut off that 2-foot extra piece? Well, I have the 6-foot piece right there that is going to become the top of my torsion box. I want it to be flush with the miter saw, but the miter saw needs to go all the way to 55 degrees, and so I have to cut an angle. So I brought it over, and thankfully it fits just underneath. I was able to rotate the miter saw all the way to that far angle and then trace a line to match it. Easy peasy. Then I grabbed my circular saw with the plate underneath and just free-handed the cut. Now this is definitely a reason for a track saw. It would have been so much easier, but I was able to do it no problem. Okay, it's a little tricky, but bear with me. So I have the bottom plate there that the miter station sits on, and then the top plate that my son is banging on is that top portion. I'm drawing a line for reference because I'm gonna have to turn this over to assemble it and then put it back, and I don't wanna forget my spot. So now the left side of the torsion box top is laying upside down. You can see the angle cut back there at the top. So I'm measuring the length of the back because I'm making a back spacer plate to go on the back side. I've got my 2 spacers there bunched together because I don't need that length in the dimension. Then I cut it to size on my temporary miter station. And then ripped it down on the table saw to the right width. Meanwhile, my kids have turned my miter station into a play area. Now all of my spacers for the torsion box are ready except for one last end that needs to match that angled cut right there. So I grabbed the one I'm going to use and I moved it out over the edge there so I could draw a straight line over that angle. Now I'm going to take it over to my miter saw and cut it at that exact angle. I just eyeballed the angle by matching it to my line. Quick test fit and boom, looks great, nice and flush. Now I'm ready to assemble the spacers to the top plate. I'm using pocket hole screws so that those fasteners stay hidden underneath. After I got one outside done, I went over and did the other outside. After that, I was able to add the back plate. Then I attached the middle spacers. I sandwiched them together because I needed the pocket holes on the outsides. These are also going to hold the drawer slides once I'm finished. Here's where those marks come into play that I made earlier. These are giving me a reference point so that those 2 spacers are lined up perfectly with the bottom base cabinets so that my drawers are lined up symmetrical. Hopefully that'll make sense here soon. I grabbed my speed square to make sure things were lined up straight and then I just screwed them all in. And I also attached them to the back there. One is done. Now it's time for the next one. I do want to point out that right where my tape measure is sitting is where another spacer will end up going. I wanted to wait and test fit it to make sure it's where I wanted it to be. Lastly, I took a few cabinet screws just to connect those 2 spacers together. Now the moment of truth to make sure this is measured out correctly. I took it over and laid it on top. No pressure, right? And it's looking good. Now you can see right where those clamps are those spacers just above the base cabinets. That's why I wanted to line those up so that those drawers will look really good. After I was set, I went back and I attached that last spacer, as you can see right by my hand. I decided just to do one shorter drawer and then leave that little opening with the angle to be able to set things like a tape measure or a ruler. So then the ultimate test. I grabbed my 4-foot level to run it across and I'm a little happy. Yeah! The next day I repeated the process on the right side for the 2-foot section and here I am test fitting it. It's the exact same approach that I did on the other side. It also has a cutout angle as well. So here's what it looks like so far. Man, that's a solid 10 feet of miter station goodness. So now just a little sanding with some 220 grit sandpaper. The last step before assembling the torsion box was to install the drawer slides in the inside of the torsion box. Since it's so skinny, there's no way to do it once it's all put together. I'm using 22-inch ball bearing drawer slides that do full extension because I wanted to maximize the space inside these guys. I cut off just a little piece of scrap to use as my spacer so that each drawer slide would be the exact same from the top. Then you just attach the drawer slides with the provided screws and you are good to go. For some of the holes, you have to move the drawer slides so that you have an opening to screw in the screw. Awesome, first one is a success. Then I just put them all in one at a time. At one point I had my awesome helper come and give me a hand. Man, that is always awesome. Yay! Okay, finished up. I've done 4 total drawer sets, 3 on one side and 1 on the other. Next, I grabbed the bottom that had been sitting on that temporary miter station over on the base cabinets. I turned it over and now this is the bottom of the torsion box. I lined up the side there to make sure everything was square. And then I grabbed my drill with the countersink bit. I want every hole to have the countersink so that that screw head can be flush because this is going to sit flush against those base cabinets. So then I just screw them in one at a time. It took a little layout though because you have to be careful to actually hit those spacers with your screws. Nice and flush. So then I just worked my way around. I drilled the countersink holes and then I screwed in the screws. After I screwed in the 8-foot section, I was able to do the 2-foot section there on the end. Then I grabbed my random orbital sander just to make sure the surface was smooth since it has to be flush with the tops of those base cabinets. And the 10-foot torsion box is ready to go. Just needs to be flipped over and moved into place. So there's my cabinets all ready to go, and then I basically moved this over myself. It was a little heavy, but I managed to get it done. And I slid it into place and yes! Looks pretty awesome. Yeah, I was pretty stoked. So then I grabbed my miter saw and slid it into place. I can't lie, I was still a little nervous if this was going to fit, and it fit perfect. So then I grabbed my 4-foot level and tested out both sides, and it is great. It's such a tricky measurement because you have to have the height right and the width and the depth and all that good stuff. And yeah, we're all good. Sweet. After that, I screwed in the torsion box from underneath using cabinet screws. I had also attached the 3 base cabinets together using the same cabinet screws. After that, I needed to adjust the right side so that it would fit perfectly square. Then I attached it the exact same way. Hey, you can see a couple drawers there that I've already made and installed. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how I do all the drawers as well as the miter station fence. So stay tuned for that. Here's a little preview of what you can expect on the next video of the Dream Miter Saw Station. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to stay connected for all my future videos. Thanks.